Is ABC Australia-wide on ABC Radio.
The findings by the West Australian Coroner in the Kimberley Inquest into the death of 13 children and teenagers by hanging is grim reading. Coroner Ros Fogliani concluded the situation in the Kimberley was dire and that all 13 deaths were preventable. Today, the state government has released its formal response, releasing what it's calling a statement of intent on Aboriginal youth suicide. Its final response to the 42 recommendations made by the coroner are expected in December. Gerry Georgatos is the National Coordinator of the National Critical Response Trauma Recovery Project, and he joins me now. It's taken 3.5 months to get to this initial formal political response from the WA government. What do you have to say about that?
It's taken 3 decades. It's 3 decades of uninterrupted crisis, unabated, and the increasing suicide crisis, there's now a permanency of that trend. We haven't abated it in any way. In terms of the Kimberley, of the last 11 suicides, 8 have been children 18 years and less. And right across the country, thus far this year in real time, with 1/3 of the year gone, there have been 67 suicides of First Nations people, of which 17 are children 18 years and less. And 1/4 of the suicides are in Western Australia, but between Queensland and Western Australia, half the suicides are in those two jurisdictions. Socioeconomic disadvantage is the primary causal narrative, and of those 66 suicides, 65 were below the poverty line, people living below the poverty line, 57 living in social rentals, in social housing, public rental housing. We must understand that the poorest Australians after the homeless live in public housing. So everything needs to correlate against the raw data, work with that, and we must understand that the narrative, the causal narrative, where pronounced negative behaviours take lives, is one of poverty. It's a poverty narrative. If we don't understand that, we're going nowhere fast.
What do you think will help solve the issue or go some way to addressing it?
What we need is more outreach. We need more task forces that work not just post-vention suicide-affected families, but also prevention. We need to work with aberrant youth. We need to work with struggling families in navigating their accumulation of life stresses, particularly below the poverty line, where they don't have the same agency to navigate them as above the poverty line. And we must understand that nearly 100% of suicides of First Nations people are of people living below the poverty line. Above the poverty line, First Nations suicides are significantly less in terms of rate to non-Indigenous Australians in terms of the rate of suicide. It's the poverty that we need to address. The more individuals that we can support through affirmative actions into education, the more individuals that we can support to meaningful activity, the more individuals that we can support to employment and training to employment. It doesn't have to be limited to needing tertiary qualifications. I've worked in the tertiary sector an awful long time, and I also know from a positive angle that First Nations students or students who are First Nations who get to the tertiary level are just as likely to graduate as their migrant brothers and sisters from socioeconomic disadvantage. They are the most likely to graduate, First Nations individuals who get that opportunity at the tertiary level. That's what we need more of. But we've got to understand that there's an intersection between poverty, and particularly acute and crushing poverty, and suicide.
Do you think, Mr. Georgatos, that this statement of intent from the West Australian government addresses that issue of poverty?
It doesn't address the issue of poverty. What they're doing is touching at the periphery. They're going to make some difference in some lives. It's about how many lives do we reach, and they're not going to reach the majority of the critically vulnerable. Let's understand that the majority of the young people that have taken their lives either lived homeless, were houseless, or lived in public housing rentals. And public housing rentals are where the poorest Australians live after the homeless. They need early intervention to validate their trauma, to disable that trauma, and to mentor them to opportunity, and to help families support them to those opportunities. I work with a lot of youth, a lot of children. The youngest suicide that I've attended, the First Nations in this country responded and worked days on end and long-haul supported the family, was of a 9-year-old. The youngest attempted suicide is of a 6-year-old. It breaks my heart. It breaks my heart.
You're listening to ABC Australia-wide.
Gerry Georgatos, who's the National Coordinator of the National Critical Response Trauma Recovery Project.